just want to introduce Barry Golding, I suppose, he's a globally recognized expert authority on the men's shed, globally, and for very good reason. He certainly earned that title with his latest book, Shoulder to Shoulder, and Barry will tell you about that soon in a couple of minutes. I think his new book, from my point of view, has managed to do a difficult job exceptionally well in writing a book which speaks to several different diverse audiences at the same time, right around the world. Not an art not conquered by too many authors, to be honest. While the sheds are individual, I suppose, as those who attend them, this book presents an overarching richness of the well-researched material demonstrated, I think, and the valuable and positive impact the sheds have had on the lives of men and women and their families and society in general, right around the world. So I will hand over to Barry, and fingers crossed that everything goes according to plan on this occasion.
Thank you, Enda. I'm assuming you can see and hear me. Thank you to Shauna and Eva, who've been trying very hard in the background just to get me on. I'm very humbled to be invited to join your Irish celebration from down under. It's summer here, it's late at night here, and it's on the other side of the world. So the fact that we're actually on it all is just fantastic. Can I firstly congratulate all Irish sheds and shedders, and the Irish Men's Sheds Association for what you've achieved in 10 years. It's pretty remarkable what you've done, and huge congratulations to everybody involved. While I'm going to mention my new book, this isn't a hard sell for my book, but some of you may be aware that I wrote a book in 2015 called The Men's Shed Movement, The Company of Men, which summarised the situation up to 2015. And so much has changed in the last 6 years during COVID, and with new sheds in many other places, including Canada, US, Denmark, and huge growth in the UK, and sheds in Iceland and Kenya. I figured it was time to revisit the whole thing during shutdown. And so my new book, which is called Shoulder to Shoulder, Broadening the Men's Shed Movement, which was published recently, includes a new chapter called Men's Sheds in Ireland, which consists of 20 pages. And can I just acknowledge here that Carrigaline Men's Shed is one of the men's sheds that contributed to a new case study of the book. Can also acknowledge that Enda and Eva, who gave me huge assistance with researching and writing the Irish chapter. For those of you who want to know a little about me, I'm an honorary professor, which basically means that I don't get any money, but I do enjoy what I do. When I'm not researching and writing, I ride my push bike. For the last 10 days, I've been riding 600 kilometres around Western Victoria as a 71-year-old. And when I'm not on my bike, I'm gardening, and when I'm not gardening, I'm doing family stuff. So I have a rich and interesting life, and I'm very privileged to be doing what I'm doing. And it's a great privilege to research men's sheds. I'd like to acknowledge a couple of things before I go any further. I'd like to acknowledge the huge contributions begun a decade ago by Johnny Roy, my friend, and later by Barry Sheridan, and now by Enda Egan in leading the Irish Men's Shed Association. Can I also acknowledge that, as you may or may not know, Ireland has the highest national men's shed density in the world. You've got 83 sheds per million people, compared to Australia with 51 sheds per million people. Having said that, we have about 1,300 sheds across Australia, certainly the most in the world. But well done for what you've achieved, and you've had huge success, I think, over the decade. By the way, if anybody wants details of what I'm saying, aside from what I'm saying, I've agreed to share with the IMSA a copy of the notes that I'm using as a background for this, which is in the form of a PowerPoint. But I figured you could do without death by PowerPoint, just suffer death by me for 20 minutes. Before COVID, there were around 390 sheds in the south and around 69 in the north. That was pre-COVID. And we're aware that quite a few dozen sheds are either closed or not currently open in Ireland. And I would also like to acknowledge in this regard that the island and the Irish people, the communities and sheds and shedders have been particularly hit hard by COVID. We've obviously all countries which have got sheds, which basically are Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, the UK, Canada, the US and Denmark, they're the countries with reasonably large movements, have all been hit hard by COVID. But Ireland, it would seem to me, and probably the UK, have been hit much more than, for example, in Australia and New Zealand. And I'm not crowing about our success or our situation, but I'm just acknowledging that things are different wherever you live in the world. And in that regard, I sense that the recovery from COVID will be difficult in Ireland for sheds, but it'll be critically important to keep supporting men, families and communities who need this support. On the upside, there's, I think, new opportunities to broaden shed reach, as I identify in my book, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. I'd like to acknowledge that you've got a number of particular Irish strengths associated with your sheds. Firstly, you've got a proud decade of shed and shedder experience. You've got, as I said before, the densest shed coverage in the world in terms of your reach and spread. You've got an energised, connected, capable and informed association, the Irish Men's Sheds Association, and I encourage all people involved to support the organisation, because we live in hard times and sticking together is very important. And on that note, I also acknowledge that you've got the encouragement and support of the close to 3,000 sheds and tens of thousands of shedders worldwide. COVID has thrown up a whole range of new insights as to what's possible and necessary when face-to-face becomes unsafe and even dangerous. And we've all learned a lot, very hard lessons, but we've all learned a lot. And I think momentum will flow from this event and flow from what's happened in the last 2 years. And I'd also like to note that there are new opportunities to collaborate with the emerging women's shed movement. I'd like to note here, some of you may not know this, but Ireland has around 1/4 of all women's sheds in the world already. You've got pretty much the same density of women's sheds in Ireland as there are men's sheds in Denmark. So you've got around 6 women's sheds per million population. And I know you're a men's shed movement, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are ways of working collaboratively, positively, and in a really interesting way, as I've just demonstrated in the Women's Shed chapter in this book, which I've co-authored with Lucia Carrigaline from Dundalk in Ireland. There's a number of reasons for focusing on broadening shed reach, which I've identified in my book. And if you want to know more about this stuff, read the book. Basically, some people think that men's sheds are just for old, white, English-speaking men. And my book, with its many case studies, shows that it's much broader already. and more inclusive already than you might think. But I do identify that there's more scope for involving more people from more diverse cultural backgrounds, for people from more diverse backgrounds, and more diverse gender backgrounds. And I'm talking here about gay men, bisexual and transgender men. The world has shifted, the world has moved, and we need to acknowledge that all men have a right to a safe space in a men's shed, as they have a safe space in the community. The other thing that I show in the book is that the demonstrated benefits are much broader than just to men. The benefits flow on to men and often their partners and their families and the wider community. And in many cases also to women, and in some cases also to children. We now know from the movements in Denmark and Iceland and Kenya that men's sheds can be tweaked to operate and be customised beyond English-speaking backgrounds. Another thing I stress in my book is that we need to broaden the reach of peak bodies and avoid competition. And I'm acutely aware that here in Australia we haven't always been good at working together. For example, the state associations and the national associations here in Australia have not always seen it eye to eye. And I've got a great admiration for the way you've worked across the north-south divide, and also the way you've worked in collaborative ways, increasingly collaborative ways, with the UK Men's Sheds Association, the Scottish Men's Sheds Association. I also see a reason to focus on broadening shed reach because a number of services and programs offered by sheds has broadened as a consequence of the COVID pandemic. And so I think the needs have also intensified and changed. And in the next few years, it'll be critically important for everybody to work together even better than they have done before. Without giving you the whole book, all I need to say is it consists of 12 chapters. First chapter talks about setting the scene, which introduces what sheds are and how they work and carries on from where my previous book left off. Then it covers men's sheds in Australia, the UK, Ireland, New Zealand, the US, Canada and Denmark, separate chapters for each of those. And then there's another chapter called Men's Sheds Elsewhere, which includes the smaller number of sheds in places like Kenya and Iceland and the Cayman Islands and various other places. Then there's a separate Women's Sheds Worldwide chapter, which includes an account of the Irish women's sheds. There's a separate chapter about all of the men's shed research evidence since 2014. And for those of you who don't know, there's now been around 70 or 80 peer-reviewed journal articles in the research literature about men's sheds. So we can't say we don't know how they work or what they do. And so I've pointed to that evidence in the book. I've also, at the end of the book, pulled it all together and said, okay, what do we know about broadening the men's shed movement? It's not a small book. It's 444 pages. The hardcover version weighs over 1 kilogram and is a serious piece of work. It's got 11 maps and it's been published in the US by Common Ground Publishing. But if you want to find it on the internet, you'll find it if you just put in Shoulder to Shoulder, Barry Golding book or something like that, you'll find it. I've got 6 international co-authors. It's been a big work, but it was a lovely project to do during lockdown. Each of the national chapters, including the Irish one, introduces the broad context for men's sheds. It summarises where they are, and in the case of Ireland, I tell you where they are by county and by region. There's a map showing where they're distributed. I revisit as many of the case studies from my previous book as I could, which in the case of Ireland was 7 cases. It tells you how men's sheds are organised, networked nationally, and in Ireland, that includes an account of how the Irish Men's Sheds Association works. I also introduced a whole lot of new case studies. There's 56 new men's shed case studies in the book, including 5 men's shed case studies, and there's 3 Irish women's shed case studies that illustrate my theme about broadening. Importantly, the book also looks at the way COVID affected sheds in different countries, including in Ireland. And on the end of each chapter, there's an overview of the evidence. And I invited the CEO or the key person in each of the national men's shed organisations to look ahead and tell us what's on the horizon. And generously, there's an account in the book from your chairman. So all up, there's 131 case studies in the book, and they're all basically written by people in sheds, co-written with me, and I think they tell it's a great yarn about how sheds work at an individual shed level. The book addresses a whole lot of big shed questions, which I won't have time to deal with now, but the main questions that I think you should be grappling with all the time are who's taking part, what are we doing, what might we be doing in the shed, what have sheds got to do with health and well-being, how should we best manage the shed, what's the role of women in the sheds, both women as supporters of the shed, women sometimes as members of the shed, and how do men's sheds relate to women's sheds or not. And it's a question I'm not going to answer, but I put in the book some ideas on how you might manage this. And the other thing the book addresses is how can the reach, impact and range of participants in sheds be broadened in the longer term. For those of you who don't know the history, I don't have time to do a full history, but all you need to know is sheds started in 1993, which is now 28 years ago. The first men's shed in the world opened just 23 years ago in 1998. Sheds spread to New Zealand in 2008. They spread to Canada, then to Ireland in 2009. The first women's shed in the world opened in 2010, and the first women's shed in Ireland opened in 2014. The UK sheds opened in 2009, Scotland in 2013, Wales in 2013. And can I just note here that the most rapid growth in the world in the last 6 years has been in Wales and Scotland and England, and to a lesser extent in the north, in Northern Ireland. But we've now also got sheds which started in Denmark in 2015 and the US in 2016. And I think they're growing really rapidly. In my book, I've got a table which has got lots of figures and stuff, but I can't summarise them briefly. All you need to know is that there's a lot of sheds in Australia, around 1,300. There's 540 in England, 120 in Scotland, 75 in Wales, 390 in Ireland, 120 in New Zealand, 19 in the US, 40 in Canada, and 33 in Denmark. And there's also, so that's a total of around 2,736 sheds pre-COVID. And as I've observed, some of them have since closed or have yet to reopen. Here in Australia, most of them, almost all sheds have reopened. There's 124 women's sheds around the world, as I said before, and there's also 16 men's shed associations, including national associations in Australia, the UK, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, New Zealand, the US, Canada, and Kenya. I've thrown down a number of challenges for all sheds in the world, but very briefly, I think there's scope for governments to provide adequate extra funding for men's health and wellbeing, for community building, as a post-COVID initiative, for post-conflict community building, engaging rural and older people, and also I think there's scope for tweaking sheds to, as we're doing here in Australia in a fairly big way, in aged and residential care settings for men who are in their fourth age of dependency. And I think this is a new frontier, including for men with dementia and acquired brain injury. I think there's scope for getting more shedders actively involved, but I think in Ireland, recovering beyond COVID, including supporting men and sheds which have shut or have lapsed and are not necessarily likely to reopen. It's really difficult situation that we're facing, and this is a global situation, and the sheds everywhere have been affected, but probably nowhere more in the world that I've seen than in Ireland and the UK. In the end of my book, I basically say there's a whole range of big picture conclusions. Firstly, sheds are expanding and making huge and positive differences to men, families, communities in very diverse settings around the world. And so those of you who are still listening to this, congratulations, you're doing a great job. And I really support and stand behind everything you're doing. I'm observing that the movement is broadening, changing and adapting to new national and cultural context, including in Ireland. But for example, the chapter that I've written about in Denmark, they're doing some really interesting, new and innovative things where men are doing stuff in nature rather than in the shed. And that was ideally timed for what was happening during the COVID pandemic. I've also observed that COVID has severely affected most sheds around the world. And I've also identified in the book that we need to keep doing research about the impact on men's health and well-being. This is critically important because governments want evidence that it's working. I put a separate chapter about women's sheds in the book because I acknowledge that women's sheds have grown rapidly and recently. I also acknowledge in my final chapter that it's important to understand how and why the shed model works. For those of you who heard me talk before, one of the reasons it works is because men are not patronised. They're not patients, they're not customers, they're not clients, they're not students. They are men with agency, able to do stuff, grab the nettle and make a difference to their lives, to the lives of the other men in the shed and also to the community. And finally, I've said that broadening shed reach should be the focus of all sheds. It's easy to, or maybe hard. A lot of people who are in sheds only see the shed that they're in. And my point in writing the book is that if you look across sheds, you'll start to see ideas for things you may not have thought of, things that might not have been on your radar that have been successful for other people. They won't always work for you, but my point is be aware, become aware that there are ways of reaching more men, more diverse men, more diverse communities, sometimes reaching women, sometimes reaching families, and sometimes reaching younger people. So with that, I'll finish up. I haven't trodden on the foot of one of the final speakers, who I think is Johnny Voy, my good friend. But I look forward to hearing what John's got to say when he comes on. So thank you, and I'll say good night, and from Australia, thank you and good morning. So I'll go back to your conference and I'll listen. Thanks very much.